Hey guys! Today we're taking a look at a recent Kickstarter campaign for a game called The Great Rat Wars, designed by Zach Law. For this campaign, I want to focus on the topic of first impressions. On any campaign page, there's a few different places where a person can begin their journey and where they can make a first impression. And for this campaign, I find that the potential first impressions are fine, but they're not strong. So we're going to be coming up with a few different ideas for how to make strong first impressions. Let's go ahead and take a look. This is The Great Rat Wars. Conquer New York City as an army of mutated rats, or defend the city with your allies in a chaotic all-versus-one tactical skirmish game. Over here we see that the page reached over 100 backers and over $15,000 in pledged funding, so it's pretty clear right off the bat that there is a demand for this product. The page just needed a little bit of help turning the corner and heading towards the finish line. So, I imagine most people are going to begin their journey by watching the intro video, but not everyone. Maybe you're on a device with a small screen, maybe you're somewhere that has a bad internet connection, maybe you're browsing Kickstarter at work, not that I would ever do that. Regardless of the reason, some people are going to be skipping this video and heading straight down here to the story section. Most of the time, I don't think the order of operations really makes much of a difference, but for this campaign in particular, I found that skipping the intro video led to a pretty negative first impression. What I see here is back in the first 48 hours to get holographic explosive promo cards. So if you've never seen it before, this is an example of an early bird reward. As the name suggests, if you back within a certain time frame or the first 100 backers, whatever it is, you get access to an exclusive reward that's never going to be offered again. And the upside to this is pretty obvious. If you arrive early at the party, you get access to something you don't get, and that might be enough of a nudge to get you to back the project if you otherwise might have been on the fence. So, early momentum in the project. Great. The downside, the risk associated with this, is for someone who arrives late to the party. They might see the people who got the exclusive rewards as sitting over there at the winners table, and they're sitting over here at the losers table. So nothing in life is perfect, there's always trade-offs. Every creator has to decide for themselves if the upside for an early bird reward is worth the risk at the end of the campaign. So, returning our attention to this, back in the first 48 hours, get holographic explosive promo cards. So having skipped the intro video, the very first thing I see is that I have missed out on an opportunity. And on top of that, I don't have enough information to evaluate what this thing is. I don't know if these cards are decorative or functional. If they're functional, I don't know how important they are in the game. I don't know how often I'm going to be looking at them or moving them around with my hands. So the first impression I have is, I'm being offered a thing that I don't know what it is, and I'm finding out that I'm too late to get it. It's kind of a double whammy. But I think that's a pretty easy problem to solve. We can just take this block of content, move it a little bit lower on the campaign page, bring it after the description, so the user has an idea in their head if they're excited about this product, after these reviews, which give legitimacy to the product, and I would suggest taking it even further, bringing it after this what's in the box section, maybe putting it right here. So now at this point, the user has enough context to evaluate the early bird reward. So that's our first point. We want to minimize the risks associated with early bird rewards. Next, let's take a look at the intro video that we skipped earlier. So the video is neatly divided in half between the first segment, which is how to play, and then the second segment, which is unique features. And I want to focus on that.
The three core unique features of the Great Rat Wars are its low randomness, the puzzle-like movement system, and the dynamically changing board on each turn. There is no dice rolling or card flipping for combat. If an enemy is within range of a skill, and within line of sight if it's required, the skill hits. This allows everyone to do what they want on their turns and be rewarded for their strategy, not punished for a bold play but a really bad dice roll.
Great, that makes sense so far. I think every game with a combat system needs some form of uncertainty in order to be exciting, and a lot of games provide uncertainty by using dice rolls. but some players hate rolling dice. So, by highlighting that feature, the game is reaching out to players like that and saying, this game is for you, keep watching.
One of the few random elements of this game are what movement cards every player has in their hand. All of the movement decks are the same, even for the rats. So this allows everyone to have the same possible movement options throughout the game while also driving each turn's strategy by what players have at their disposal at any given moment. Players will need to chain together their different movement cards to optimally position their characters around the map, while keeping in mind what they plan to do on future turns and what cards they may need.
Also seems cool. Seems pretty simple, elegant, interesting, easy to teach. Ticks a lot of boxes for me, makes me want to keep watching.
The board state is always changing due to the fact that players are able to accomplish so much on each turn. New rats are constantly spawning, and the terrain being removed from the board throughout the game. All of this keeps players engaged and continually updating their strategies.
Unfortunately, I feel that this is where the video kind of falls off the rails a little bit. It does not leave a particularly strong impression at the end. So, a dynamically changing board, that strikes me as a phrase that can describe a lot of games. If I think back to the games that I've played most recently with friends, Terraforming Mars, Scythe, Beyond the Sun, Carcassonne, all of those feature dynamically changing board. So that phrase isn't so much a unique feature as kind of the bare minimum for us to consider playing a game. Again, I think this has a pretty simple solution. The game looks like it has a lot of interesting ideas in it. I think the designer just needs to reach in, pluck out something different, and talk about it more specifically. Or, if the dynamically changing board is something they really want to focus on, maybe find a different way of talking about it, a different phrase that sets it apart from other games that also have dynamically changing boards. Regardless of the solution that we use, the key takeaway here is we want to avoid making statements that can apply to any board game. Next, let's take a look at the How to Play section. This section uses some digital animations that are snippets borrowed from the intro video. And let's consider this from the perspective of two different use cases. For the first use case, let's imagine we've watched the entire intro video. Because these are snippets from that same video, the behavior we're likely to exhibit is we're going to say, okay, yeah, I've seen this. I already know this stuff. Show me something new. And we're going to keep scrolling, ignoring the entire section until we find something we haven't seen before. So, not a particularly strong first impression. Now let's consider the other use case, someone who hasn't watched the intro video. I'm going to scroll down until I see something interesting. I see a player map that's being highlighted with an orange glow, and then nothing else happens. I see a top-down view of some game pieces with some squiggly lines drawn between them. The problem here is that neither of these animations is particularly exciting on their own, and they also don't convey much information on their own. This animation in particular doesn't start to make sense until we read the text that comes after it. Humans are going to have to decide on how to split their time between attacking the rats, which presumably are these red lines, and searching through the trash to find items, which presumably are the yellow lines. So now it does make sense. But because this text comes afterwards, I might not ever see it. Or if I'm a non-native English speaker, I might choose not to read it, and I'm only going to be looking at the animations to evaluate the product. So we've got two possible use cases. For someone who has watched the intro video, this content is redundant, and for someone who hasn't watched the intro video, this content isn't really exciting and doesn't convey information on its own. So for either use case, it's not really clear who this is going to provide a strong first impression for. Now, one tactic that we can use to try to solve this problem is, after we design the campaign page, but before it goes live, find some people who have never played the game, show them the page, ask them to look at content in a specific order, and then ask them guided questions about it. Does this make sense? Does this make you want to learn more? Does this make you want to play the game? If the answer is yes, great, keep it. If the answer is no, make tweaks and repeat the process, or if it's really not working, consider cutting the content altogether. Regardless of what solution you end up using, the overall takeaway is the same. We want to design the page with real users in mind. Next, let's take a look at the stretch goals. Stretch goals are something that make the Kickstarter experience feel distinct from buying a game on Amazon or at your local game store. So because it's distinct, this is something where people are going to focus their attention first. It's another opportunity to make a strong first impression. Unfortunately, I think that first impression is weakened a little bit by the fact that there's a typo in this heading. We're missing the letter T in the word stretch. It's not a big deal, these things happen, and not everyone is even going to notice that. But it's another grain of rice to add to the bucket labeled, make sure someone scrutinizes this page before it goes live. If you've got a friend with some writing experience, they're going to be able to find these things for you. Anyway, taking a look at the first stretch goal, at the $50,000 mark, we see upgrade Soldier Rat dice from 19mm to 24mm. This is not particularly exciting to me, and just to make sure that I'm not the oddball, I showed this part of the page to a few people that I play board games with, and they all had the same first impression, and there's one phrase that I kept hearing over and over again. This is probably going to sound harsh, but that phrase was, "Who cares?" The reality is that the difference between 19mm and 24mm is not exciting to people. And that's particularly true if we scroll up and see how these dice are being used in the game. There's nothing in this animation that suggests why the difference in size would be meaningful. We're not stacking things on top of each other, we're not plugging things into slots. They're just objects moving around on a table. So, stretch goals, another opportunity. Unfortunately, I think this one misses the mark. So, a tactic that we can use to try to avoid this problem is whenever we're playtesting our game, or just playing any other board game with our friends, we want to vocalize out loud the fantasies that we have about what we wish we had on the table, and ask our friends to do the same thing. Stuff like having token trays to keep things organized, or making the miniatures be full color instead of monochromatic, whatever it is. Vocalize these fantasies out loud. From that, kind of build a mental library of what we wish we had on the table, and then from that library, pick out the ones that seem most appropriate for the game we're working on, and use those as the stretch goals. So the key takeaway here for how we can make a stronger first impression is to choose stretch goals that fulfill the user's fantasies. So, for an example of a campaign that does that really well, let's take a look at this campaign page for Mothership, a campaign that was successful. Its first two stretch goals were a box insert and control panel indents, essentially just slots on one of the game boards. I love both of these. Whenever a game doesn't have these, I wish that it did, and whenever a game does have these, I'm really grateful for it because it makes things so much easier. So this fulfills a user's fantasy. Upgrading dice from 19mm to 24mm does not fulfill a fantasy. So, for a quick recap of the things that we talked about today on how to make strong first impressions, there are 4 things we identified. We want to minimize the risks associated with early bird rewards. We want to avoid making statements that can apply to all board games. We want to design the page with real users in mind. And we want to choose stretch goals that fulfill the user's fantasies. Hope you guys found this helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.